Statement by Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States of America.
Many people are asking, so I'll give it to you now. It is 100% true. While playing with the legendary Magic player, Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa, two-time Pro Tour champion and Hall of Famer, I comboed off on turn 0. It took place in round 2 of the draft where I had a magnificent opening hand. People are saying one of the greatest opening hands of all time, you know. I began by playing my Gemstone Caverns as pregame action, brilliantly exiling my counter spell, which I would not need. Then I exiled Simian Spirit Guide from my hand and cast Flash. Whereupon I put the very big World Spine Worm into play. Have you seen this thing? It's really big, folks, really big. Paulo conceded immediately, of course, realizing he had been bested. I won't tell you who won the draft because I'm a modest individual, and you will then say I was bragging, and I don't like people who brag.
Without any further ado, welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy. I'm here with my co-host, Anthony Dual Snake Eyes Maddox.
Oof, that was a rough moment.
Was it rough? I thought it was great.
It was great. It was a great moment.
It was the highlight of my Cube weekend. I ended up putting an intro before last week's episode, but we recorded last week's main episode prior to the weekend where we had a couple friends come down from New York to play Cube with us all weekend, and we went pretty hard on the Cube. We found ourselves, I'm just going to go ahead and say, play the Brags and Bad Beats theme right here.
Reveling in victory. That's Brags. Drowning in defeat.
That's Beats.
I'll tell you all about it on Brags and Bad Beats.
Okay, great. We found ourselves about 12:30 in the morning. It was a draft of the regular Cube. You and a friend of ours in our local play group have both drafted the most go wide and go big and interactionless decks I've ever seen drafted from your regular Cube.
We were two equal and opposite forces.
And you played 2 games in the time that the rest of the table played 2 whole rounds. They just played a round and they were like, they're still playing. Let's just swap up our matchups and just play another round. And then you were 1-1 and it was like, all right, you got to finish this round. You're not going to have time to play a third game. It's impossible. You decided to put it up to a die roll.
We got to figure out pairings somehow. Let's do a die roll. High roll wins. Easy.
I mean, just to say it, the pairings were already a little messed up on account of the fact that they had already played 2 rounds. But, you can work backwards from there. You decided, leave it to a die roll. You each rolled a d6 simultaneously. Snake Eyes.
No problem. We'll re-roll.
Which is, it's a little surprising, but that's a 1 in 36 chance. That's not that unlikely for that to happen. And then you rolled again, and it was double Snake Eyes again. And so you had to play a third game.
We had to. The dice had spoken.
The dice had spoken. They said, you are not settling this via die roll. You have to play a third game.
You have to deal.
I have to say, I can't even remember. Who won that third game? Did you end up getting there?
I don't remember. We played so much Cube. And then we did another draft after that.
We did do another draft after that.
Where I got Fork Glimpse the Unthinkable, or is that what it's called?
Yes, that is what it's called.
That was rude. It's just like, and now you're just... Get rid of your deck. Bye. Sorry.
Gold Cube do be like that. I gotta say, of all the cubes we played over the weekend, which was a lot of cubes, the one I had the most fun with was definitely the Gold Cube. I love Daniel's Gold Cube.
I had the most fun with Andrew's 555 Jank Cube just because I felt like my draft was...
That's like a powered cube, right? It's
right.
Like
so this is a little bit surprising. This is not usually what I love, but my draft felt like it was kind of going off the rails. But then I ended up with Young Pyromancer and Monastery Mentor and Sedgemoor Witch and was like, can I get enough non-creature spells to just do like Mardu, Spells Matter? And it was a lot of fun.
Was it only your favorite draft because you won?
I mean, I went 2-1.
Oh, I thought
Jay got me in the finals.
That's right. Of course. That's how Jay does.
It was fun just because it felt like a lot of my decisions mattered, especially like a lot of the hand hate. It felt like I was playing a lot of games where I was just using a discard spell and then keeping my opponent one step behind. Also, I got to ephemerate Grief, and that was rude.
I am so surprised to hear that this was your favorite Cube experience of the weekend.
Are
you surprising yourself?
It's fun to Grief ephemerate one time. I don't ever need to do that again.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it was a great weekend. The Gold Cube really got me, though. It's just like the
Gold Cube was great.
The thing about that cube is that it offers you the opportunity to play sequences of cards you could never play in any other context, and that novelty is still so exciting to me, even on the 12th or whatever draft of that cube I'm on at this point. I had one game where I curved, oh boy, am I going to remember these card names? Boros whatever guy.
Boros whatever.
It's a 2-mana 1/2 double striker from original Ravnica. And I played that on turn 1 because the gold cube, you start the game with a Pillar of the Parents in place. So turn 1, 1/2 double striker. Turn 2, Champion of Iroas. I think I got that right. Or a Rowan Champion. Oh boy, one of the two. And that's a 2/2 double striker for 3.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Turn 4, True Fire Mentor. The red, white card from Guilds of Ravnica with Mentor.
Those kinds of, that cycle of cards with those aggressive costs tend to go pretty late. It's hard to make those work. I think.
And so far you're thinking like, Andy, what do you mean you played a novel sequence of cards? These are all just Boros cards. You're just playing a red-white deck. On turn 4, I played Abzan Ascendancy, and it was disgusting.
Sure. So you had the most fun just curving out with some creatures and attacking. I had the most fun in Powered Cube. We're all off today.
I like to.
We're expanding.
I like to curve out and attack. I'm always playing aggro in all of our cubes. I argue because most people don't respect it enough.
That is true.
I'm trying to draft what's open. I'm trying to draft the hard way, and people are just leaving aggro open for me, and so that's what I end up taking most of the time. It's not actually a preference.
Fair enough.
I would rather play blue-red all the time. That's my favorite deck to play. Like a blue-red tempo-y deck is chef's kiss.
I did. Which cube did I draft blue-red in? I drafted a lot of Young Pyromancers this weekend is what it comes down to.
Card is really good.
Card's a fun card.
It's really good. What do you think of the art on Young Pyromancer?
It's not great.
I don't think it's very good either, but I think most people like it, and it has achieved like a reverent, that is the only Young Pyromancer art status, such that I don't know if we're likely to get alternative arts in the future. I've always wanted an alternative art, though, because I don't love it.
Have you sort of checked out Wizards' whole MO lately?
Just printing them.
That we're going to get more of. It's just a question.
I would have thought it would have happened by now. All the secret layers, all of the master sets. We did get the O Border Foil Young Pyromancer, which is a new printing, but same art. I would have thought by now it would have happened, but
we're going to get like the Thalia style secret layer. Young Pyromancers.
It's just 5 different Young Pyromancers, 4 different Young Pyromancers.
There's going to be like a really baby one.
I don't think that quite works.
Lighting a mobile on fire. Slightly older, just burning something else. I don't know.
Vaping?
Teen Pyromancer.
Man, that's pretty good.
Blowing some cotton.
A bit of a potpourri episode today. We got a little bit of follow-up, mostly from our last episode, which, Anthony, I got to say, aside from when we talk about cooking, we got the most feedback we've ever gotten on an episode to our last episode, which was rock beats paper, paper beats scissors, scissors beats rock, our episode about the rock, paper, scissors metagame and whether or not it is an intrinsic attribute of Magic the Gathering. I gotta say, most of the comments we got were overwhelmingly positive, though it was a kind of hot take that we put out there. We got some pushback on a couple of things. I want to cover a lot of the feedback we got because I think a lot of it was really helpful too. Like, I think the feedback was great. And I think a lot of it comes down to, or so why it's different is we're both talking about something that's a little bit more concrete and is sort of part of the existing language of the game. So people have thoughts and opinions and like reasonable ideas about it. And also it is a difficult question where we're trying to quantify things that are really difficult to quantify. So there's a lot of just valuable different perspectives on it. Yeah, and it was a big topic, too big to cover in just one episode. There was obviously a lot we didn't get to. And to me, the stuff people call it out in the feedback is like the next highest priority things to mention. So I feel like we could put maybe a nice little bookend on last episode by covering some of those things we didn't get to that people brought up. But first, Anthony, we got 2 things to do. First thing we got to do is talk about CubeCon, because if people don't know, CubeCon is back on. This is a competitive cubing event that is organized by John Terrell of Cultic Cube, friend of the show, who has been on the podcast before, and J-Bro, who everyone knows as one of the most storied and accomplished drafters of the Magic Online Vintage Cube, and Gwen Decker from Cube Cobra, and a bunch of other people. This is an in-person paper cube-focused Magic event that's going to be happening October 20th to 23rd this year in Madison, Wisconsin. Anthony and I are going to be there. I mean, I guess we can't promise 100%. There is still looming pandemic stuff. It's possible that shit hits the fan and we don't make it. But as of right now, we are both planning on attending this event and very excited about it. This was supposed to happen in 2020. Something happened. I can't remember what. They had to cancel it. And so now, 2 years later, it is finally coming to fruition. And I couldn't be more excited, Anthony. An important thing we wanted to mention on this episode now, I know this event isn't until October, so a lot of you may be thinking you're going to decide later if you're going to go or not. But until April 15th, which is a little less than 2 weeks after this episode comes out, They are accepting submissions of cubes to be played at CubeCon as part of the official sanctioned tables. So if you want to bring your cube with you to Madison, you want a bunch of people to draft it as part of the official CubeCon organized events, you can submit it. And what's going to happen is after all these cubes have been submitted, there's going to be a big community voting process. So the community is actually going to decide which of the submitted cubes are going to get played. But don't worry, if you want to play your cube or someone else's cube and it doesn't end up becoming one of the cubes that actually gets officially sanctioned by CubeCon, of course, there's just going to be nothing but pods firing all weekend, right? Formal pods as part of the actual organization of the event and just informal pickup games that are be going all the time. So bring your cube, bring your games, and play against Anthony and I maybe.
Or don't bring your cube. Don't feel like you have to be a experienced, seasoned cube player that has this curated cube to come play. Like, this can just be a great way to dive in to the deep end of cube.
Something that has always interested me is that our listenership is substantially larger than the number of people that reply to our survey for cube testing sets. And I also know that a lot of people that reply to that survey don't listen to our podcast, either because they don't like us, or they don't listen, or because they don't listen to podcasts at all.
Fair.
Totally fair. So there's a huge chunk of you that maybe don't even design cubes. You listen to this podcast because you just like thinking about Magic. Maybe you like playing cube online, but you don't have your own cubes. You do not need your own cube to come. Just come if you want to play cube. And to me, like, even if I didn't design cubes, didn't care about the format, this has got to be like the most exciting way to play Magic, full stop, right? You just get to show up and draft a bunch of different, very carefully, lovingly curated environments, get a different experience every time you sit down at a table. It's going to be great. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one of the most fun things about Magic is drafting a new set, like cracking open new cards. Not everybody knows what the established metagame is.
That's the most the best way to play Magic, in my opinion.
I know that there's a lot of value to the other extreme of that, but I think there's so much fun in just that first sort of exploration. And so just getting to sit down and do like draft after draft. And after just doing that, well, on a slightly smaller scale this weekend, I was a little bit exhausted. I needed a day off, but I am just now extra energized for playing more Cube and especially for just doing another big event.
We were also hosting, which I think is a big drain of energy. You cooked for like 10 to 12 people, had to do all the dishes, all the prep. That is really exhausting. I think if you were just playing Cube, you might have a little more stamina.
It's worth it.
This is a good time to mention that I can only assume, Anthony, that Wizards of the Coast, Mark Rosar probably listens to this podcast. He heard us talking about how much I missed the actual pre-release being before the digital release of the Magic cards, and how that was such a beautiful opportunity to play Magic in this pristine
because we know that
environment.
that Mark Rosewater is the person that makes those decisions, and that he's not a very busy person and has time to listen to our stupid podcast.
Of course, yeah. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Maro.
Anyway, they heard us. They heard our pleas, and for New Capenna at least, is it Capenna? Capenna? It's got two N's. It makes me think Capenna, but I would have assumed Capenna.
I'll ask a demon next time I meet them.
We're going to figure out what it is before we do our set review episodes. Anyway, for the next set coming out, they have switched it so that we are going back to the pre-release being an actual pre-release prior to the digital release of the cards, which I hope people flood Wizards of the Coast with positive feedback so that becomes the new norm going forward for sets. I should say the old norm. It's how it always was until, I guess it was around the beginning of the pandemic. They were like, let's just do digital release before actual pre-release, because why not? It does
feel like a lot of things are returning to quote-unquote normal. We got organized play changes and CubeCon. Great.
Pro Tour. Ooh, feel good. Got a lot of good energy. Go check out the CubeCon website. It's mtgcubecon.com. We will, of course, put the link in the show notes. And you have a little under 2 weeks to submit your cube if you want it to be drafted officially at CubeCon. But of course, if you don't want to do that for whatever reason, you can also just bring it along and play, or just show up with a playmat, a couple dice, and sit down and play with people's cubes all weekend. That's how you should be marketing this event. I'm going to talk to John. They should be trying to market this event to like a much broader audience of like everybody. Like, this is just the best way to play Magic.
I agree.
Full stop.
I mean, we talk a lot about Cube as sort of a game design exercise, but in reality, if you're sitting down with your 8 friends to do a Cube draft, 7 of those people are not designing the Cube. So we need more people that are just Cube players and not
If every single person shows up to CubeCon with their own cube, there's going to be a lot of disappointed cubes that don't get drafted. So we're going to need some players. I
just want to put them all in a big pile and just see what that looks like.
That would be guess how much money is on this table at this convention center. It's going to be a thing. One more point of business before we get into our main topic. We got to do a pack one pick one from a listener submitted cube, Anthony. This week's cube comes to us from listener Gasedup. Well, I would have assumed it's Gasedup, but the gas only has one S, so is it Gasedup?
Gasedup, I believe that's correct.
Gasedup. Anyway, Gasedup has submitted a 180 card Grixis cube. It's a micro Grixis cube. It is drafted in packs of 7, so very tiny little packs. And this list, Anthony, has 0 creatures. So this is like some weird combination of like, it's a similar size to like the Degenerate Micro Cube or some of those tuber cubes that are floating around, but it's completely creatureless. So it reminds me a little bit of my Jeskai Control Battle Box 2, where you're going to be slinging spells back and forth at each other, there's some creatures in that environment, but not that many. It's a very interesting conceit for a cube design, and the pack is, again, small pack of only 7 cards. It is Smash to Smithereens, Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, Skull Cage, Voltaic Key, Peer Through Depths, Engineered Explosives, and Mana Drain. Does anything jump out of you on this pack, Anthony?
You know, thanks for finally throwing me a little bit of an easier one. I think that Mana Drain is, in basically any format, head and shoulders above most other cards you're going to see. So
it's pretty bad in the DMC, I gotta say. It's basically just Counterspell in the
DMC. There are weird places. It wouldn't be great in the Turbo Cube either.
That's true.
But here in a somewhat more normal Magic environment, I think Mana Drain is going to be great. It's really hard to pass that. I do want to talk a little bit about some of these other cards, though, because this is a weird environment that's creatureless, so you're going to have to find a way to win. And we do actually have a couple other win conditions here. Voltaic Key is noted as being a combo piece, which is one of your win conditions. We have Skull Cage, which seems a little bit slower. I don't think it's going to be one of the go-to win conditions, but still, it's a way to kill your opponent.
It's got sick art.
Lastly, Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, sort of similar to Laboratory Maniac and Thassa's Oracle, is another interesting win condition. So those are cards I'm looking at, but I'm definitely not taking them over Mana Drain.
I am also on Mana Drain, which I think will surprise no one. I think Jace is pretty close behind and in a pretty clear tier above the rest of this pack. The win condition of just don't worry about my opponent's life total, just continue to play answers, and eventually I will draw Jace, and then I'll keep playing answers, and I'll just win the game by decking myself. It's a very compelling win condition to me in an environment like this. And I think Planeswalkers are going to be premium and some of the most important cards you can stick to the table.
It also, in addition to being a win condition, it does generate a lot of value.
Absolutely,
so it does stuff even when you're not just winning the game with it.
It's a really, really strong card. And in an environment like this where I know that aggro in the like creature aggro sense, like if there's a fast deck, it's pressure my life total, it is not going to be with small creatures. I'm going to have some time to set up, and Planeswalker that just draws a bunch of cards and eventually wins me the game for doing whatever my deck is doing is quite good. I don't expect it to wheel. I think it's by far the next best card in this pack. I'll take the Mana Drain, and I'll be a little sad that I'm not playing Jace.
Sorry, Jace.
Sace. All right, Anthony, feedback time. Again, we got a lot in our last episode. Thank you to everybody that sent feedback in, especially people that just, send in some nice, thoughtful, positive feedback. A friendly reminder, if you ever want to just write a little review for the show on iTunes, I know it feels like kind of archaic, like who's listening to the podcast on iTunes anymore? Everyone's listening on Spotify and whatever. But it really does help the show in terms of just getting a little more publicity in the #1 podcast marketplace. And it really helps too when we have potential guests we want to have on, and we can like link to the show and they can say, oh, this is legit. This is not just 2 guys sitting in their basement talking into microphones.
It is also that.
Yeah, but the reviews though, I mean. So anyway, if you want to leave us a review, we really appreciate it. Anthony, there's one piece of feedback we got that is by far the most important and the biggest omission I think we've ever made on this podcast. When we did a Pack One Pick One last week from that cube, we completely missed the fact that you can name commanders with the hidden agenda conspiracies.
That's embarrassing.
What a punt.
So exactly the thing we're like, these are less powerful because of, this particular aspect of the game was completely wrong.
Completely wrong. And to update my picks, I think those conspiracies are now extremely powerful. And I'm just going to take all the conspiracies, I think.
Okay.
That's what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to go ahead and update my pick to whatever the best 2 of those 3 conspiracies were. I'm going to name my commanders, which I hope I will still have multiple, with my hidden agenda cards and make them even more powerful. I guess it kind of tips our hand a little bit. We don't play that many cubes with conspiracies, and we don't play that many commander cubes, so I didn't think about that unique combination of those 2 types of environments, but very cool to think about drafting conspiracies that are essentially like the non-hidden agenda, you always get this effect kind of conspiracies, but they're tied to you still having to cast your commander at least, right? It's kind of like you just augment your commander and make it even better. And again, the fact that everyone has access to it, it seems like a lot of really cool opportunities to combine specific commanders with specific hidden agenda conspiracies to make very cool decks.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just double down on this being the Why is Cube the greatest format and the greatest way to play Magic podcast, you can't do that anywhere else. Honestly, you can't even play conspiracies anywhere else. Like, you can't really just put them in your commander deck. That doesn't really make sense. But in Cube, that's where you get to do it, and where you even get to do these like next level things of putting it in specifically a commander cube to make these cards play out in this different, unique, novel way.
Yeah, and part of the reason I've never designed a commander or multiplayer cube is I've never felt like that spark of inspiration where it's like, this is so cool, I want to do this. And when as soon as the listener whose pack we did last week pointed out, hey, by the way, you missed this, I was like, oh shit. And also, that's very cool, and I kind of want to design a cube like that now.
Yeah, we had a similar experience. One of the cubes that we drafted this weekend was an Archenemy cube, and the most exciting part of that draft by far was seeing
how many cards say each opponent.
Yeah, that specifically, it was also interesting. It was still drafted in a pot of 8, but you knew beforehand if you were the Archenemy or you were one of the other players. So there were so many cards where it's like, oh, well, this actually lets me do a positive thing for myself or potentially an ally. Or this is something that like really dominates as the archenemy, and those kinds of recontextualizations of cards is one of the most fun parts about Cube.
Yeah, combat tricks would be so much better in that environment because you have 2 other players with which to have creatures in play. You're basically going to completely eliminate the possibility of being in that situation where your deck has no creatures in play and you're stuck with combat tricks riding in hand. You just use them on your opponent's creatures.
Yeah, totally.
Draft like a support role, basically. You play a support character. You're the cleric of the party.
I love it.
The bard, just singing songs and making all of your teammates' creatures bigger. Anyway, that's by far the most important feed we got on the episode last week, and frankly, I'm hugely embarrassed to have missed it. The rest of this feedback all does pertain specifically to our conversation last week about the rock, paper, scissors meta, whether or not that is intrinsic or natural to a game of Magic the Gathering. If you have not listened to last week's episode, I might recommend it. We try as much as possible to make these episodes work in isolation. We know that not everybody listens to every episode, so we want episodes to stand alone, but some of this might not make total sense if you weren't privy to the last week's conversation. To summarize it in brief, we talked about how there is a trend, an assumption in Magic that there's this natural aggro beats control, control beats midrange, and midrange beats aggro to this like tempo axis of Magic, and there's just naturally favored matchups between those decks. And I basically made the argument last week that doesn't actually really hold up to the realities of Magic, and really all that matters in terms of what deck is favored in a given matchup is what cards it has access to in that given meta or format. First, a correction. I mentioned in last week's episode that as an example of how the specific cards are critically important to what decks are viable, I had said that Delver decks in Legacy only exist because of Delver of Secrets' card being printed. And a couple of people, specifically Reddit user kindly off, stay classy Reddit, and Dom Harvey, a great accomplished Magic player, Dom Harvey, pointed out that...
Could be the same person.
I don't think it is. Pointed out that there have been Delver-style decks in Legacy, for sure, before Delver of Secrets specifically. You know, they don't look exactly the same, and we could argue nuances, but certainly there were definitely a lot of decks that played very cheap threats and a suite of interaction to protect them and keep the board clear for them to attack. Reddit user kindly off linked to a list of the Legacy decks from the 2007 World Championship, and it has 20 or 30 decks on this page. Really enlightening to look at these decks in terms of just thinking about how context changes the evaluations of cards. This is a bunch of Legacy deck lists. There were way more Nimble Mongooses in these decks, Anthony, than there were Lightning Bolts. There was only, I think, 3 decks.
A lot of Nimble Mongooses running around. Lightning Bolt doesn't do that much.
Exactly. The most Delvery style decks were certainly these decks that had Nimble Mongoose and Tarmogoyf, and then a bunch of interaction basically to protect it. And Lightning Bolt not that good against Nimble Mongoose and Tarmogoyf. So in this particular moment of Legacy, Lightning Bolt, which is this card which has this air of just eternal playability, always good, just wasn't really in that many decks. I think it was in 3 decks, and it was only a 4 of in 1 of them, if memory serves. It's just not that played. There were other burn spells that were much more played, interestingly enough. Another way to find decks from Legacy that are kind of similar to Delver decks but predate it is to look up the, quote, Canadian Threshold deck, which refers to the threshold, I believe, on Nimble Mongoose. Mm-hmm. Interesting to think about Nimble Mongoose being a potent enough threat to basically carry a whole deck in Legacy.
Magic has changed. Magic design has changed.
Well, I mean, we say that, but then, how much different is Nimble Mongoose from Dragon's Rage Channeler? A little different, but
it's pretty different.
It's not that different, I don't think.
It's fairly different.
Is it? You're trading Delirium for Threshold. You're trading Flying and Must Attack for Hexproof.
Flying is a really good keyword. Anyway, if you'd like to write in and tell us exactly how Nimble Mongoose and Dragon's Rage Channeler are different Magic cards.
I'm just saying, I don't think they're that different. I do think Dragon's Rage Channeler is better. They're very similar cards in terms of what they do. 1-mana cards that grow to 3/3s based on the number of cards in your graveyard and have some conditional
as far as we're talking
upside.
about like the role in the deck, that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just a whiff for me. I probably should refrain from making broad statements about things like Legacy when I have basically not played that much Legacy in my entire life. And more importantly, I've only been paying attention to things like Legacy, even passingly, for about the last 5 or 6 years. And so I'm not aware of the whole history of Legacy, so I should just be, I was like, it's called the Delver deck. Of course it's all about Delver Secrets. There's a wrong assumption on my part.
I mean, it's very confusing because, of course, it's all about Delve, a great mechanic everyone loves.
It's kind of broken, but that's not Delve's fault. It's probably Delve's fault. And next up, I want to address, I think, a theme throughout a lot of the feedback, which was basically people that, like you said, these ideas, aggro, mid-range, control, they're widespread ideas, and they're not perfectly defined, such that everybody kind of has a slight different take on what these words mean and what an aggro deck looks like or is supposed to do or how it functions. And this is even between seasoned to pro players. I'm going to get to specific articles later on where different pros refer to these decks and they explicitly define them differently and say, it's impossible to define these, who really cares, but we're going to use this definition for right now. So these terms are inherently flexible. And because of that, a lot of the feedback was basically people that these terms mean slightly different things to them, and so their conception of this entire meta is slightly different because they have a different definition for these terms, which brought up a big point, which I think is something that's really important we didn't touch on last week, which is that to me, I think a lot of the differences we're talking about, and we're getting really in the weeds here about specific, terminology and details, but I think a lot of the differences between what we were talking about last week on the show and people that may see it a little bit differently is really just a difference of framing. And the example I have for that is that, if you think, for example, that aggro decks look a certain way and aggro decks are inherently unfavored against midrange, that's part of your belief about Magic, then when you sit down to draft an aggro deck, you're of course going to draft an aggro deck that behaves the way you think an aggro deck should behave, which means it's going to be unfavored against midrange. You're going to perceive any card that makes you better in the midrange matchup as kind of off plan, as a sideboard card, as a plan B. You don't want to be playing Flame Slash or whatever because you would just rather have Burn that goes face, so it's good against control too. You're going to think about that in that way. And that's really just a matter of how you define that term, right? You might still draft the same cards. You might still have a deck that ends up with a Flame Slash in it. You're just thinking of that as a slightly off-plan card or a plan B or something that makes your deck less focused. Whereas I might just say that's part of what aggro is. That's inclusive of the definition of an aggro deck, is that it has to have ways to beat midrange. And so a lot of this, I think, is kind of self-fulfilling, right? If you just think that's what aggro is, you're going to draft that kind of deck, and then you're going to have that experience too, right? If you're passing up on the cards that would make aggro better against midrange, either for inclusion in your cube or in a specific draft, then you're just going to have the experience of your idea being reinforced, right? Because you're going to assume that aggro decks are not good against midrange. Your deck's going to be a little bit soft to midrange, and you're going to lose to midrange. That's just how it's going to go. So a lot of this, I think, just comes down to that framing. And as soon as you say, all right, let's, instead of framing aggro as this very narrow deck that's 1 mana, 2/1s, that can't beat a resolved 3/3 and just has to kind of scoop, instead of defining it that way, let's define it more broadly. And then all of a sudden, those heuristics of, well, midrange always beats aggro or is always heavily favored against aggro just kind of fall away. So a lot of this comes down, I think, to those definitions of those terms.
I think a lot of the feedback that was a little bit more critical does come down to the fact that I think that maybe you're setting up a little bit of a straw man in talking about these in really, really specific terms. I mean, even when we broke down the structures that were mentioned in a lot of the articles, like the sort of formalized rock, paper, scissors explanations of Magic, a lot of them didn't even include midrange because that just wasn't relevant in the meta. So I think that's sort of the extra nuance that came from a lot of the more critical feedback.
I did end up running polls on Lucky Paper Twitter feed at Lucky Paper MTG, and those polls did reinforce the rock, paper, scissors idea, right? Because to your point, I tried to find a canonical example of this idea, which I have believed is always just in the water, right? When it comes to talking about Magic. And I couldn't find an article that was here's the rock, paper, scissors meta, and here's how it's favored. I couldn't find one canonical piece that was clearly defining this idea. But I ran polls, and they definitely lined up with the assumptions, right? I asked who wins a given matchup, and I gave the 2 options, and a third option, it depends, which is, of course, when I clicked on all of them. And it depends was always the second most popular answer, but in each of them, the decks that we presented last week as being favored got more votes. Now, it did actually vary kind of dramatically in terms of how many more votes based on specific matchups, which is maybe another nuance we can go into. So I hear that. And a lot of people basically said, hey, mid-range doesn't exist anymore, or you can't talk about mid-range without talking about planeswalkers, or that used to be true 10 years ago, but now it's not anymore because cards are too powerful. All that may be true. And if that's the case, then all of that to me just reinforces my point that this idea doesn't hold water, right? And if your point is that this idea never held water, then okay, sure, maybe I agree with you. If your point is that this idea held water 10 years ago but doesn't anymore, then I would say, okay, then that is just evidence that it wasn't actually a robust, beautiful, elegant, sticky idea. It only worked for a specific set of cards. And like I said, as new cards get printed, that idea changes completely. But all that feedback to me and like the variety of different ways people like push back against it just kind of reinforced it like, yeah, this is not a thing, right? And so I hope I'm not setting up a straw man because I don't intend to do that. I've definitely seen lots of people talk. And again, I have specific articles here where reference from LSV and PVDDR that do basically say this is how this works. I guess maybe the people that thought I was setting up a straw man, right, they were already a step ahead of me. They were like, of course it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that does seem a little bit like what was happening. It's also interesting that like exactly what is the question, the thesis here is a little bit difficult to pin down even because it's like, is this a thing that is real? Is it a thing that is useful? There are different ways that you could phrase that question that sound very similar but are not.
Well, let me take this opportunity to then restate my thesis just to make it abundantly clear. I do not think that it is intrinsic in Magic that specific speed decks have favored or unfavored matchups against other decks of different speeds. I think depending on the specific meta or format you find yourself in, you can find favored and unfavored matchups in every combination, just depending on what cards are present in that particular format. I think the reason this idea has persisted is because when you get to the why, that part is true. When you probe this idea a little bit and ask somebody that believes in the rock, paper, scissors meta, why does mid-range beat aggro, why does control beat mid-range, etc., etc., the reason why is true when...
For the card pool of vanilla creatures.
No. I mean, the reason why is true in a lot of metas when the cards happen to fall that way, right? It just, sometimes that is the case. And so that why is true, and those are good ideas we should hold on to. My whole argument is that we should not jettison the opposite ideas, which are that these matchups can also go the other way, and here is how they go the other way when they go the other way. And so to me, it's like, the ideas are important, and it's because you have to go just one layer deeper and say why. Why can a deck win in this matchup or lose in this matchup? And not just adopt the binary, well, here's a simple idea. It's just a cycle that goes this direction, and that's just how it is.
Right.
To that point, a lot of people linked me to an article that LSV wrote that was about midrange and why midrange is bad. The article is titled Initial Technology, The Meaning of Midrange and Why It's Terrible. It was published in May of 2009. I got to be honest, Anthony, did you have a chance to read this article from one of the places people mentioned it?
I did not yet.
That's okay.
It's in an open tab still on a distant desktop.
I think it's worth a read, but I have to say I found this article to be a little bit puzzling and frustrating. To summarize it, basically, LSV says mid-range decks are bad because they don't have a focus strategy. He defines mid-range decks as always trying to play the opposite role of whatever their opponent is playing, which I think is actually a pretty elegant definition of it, which is pretty close to how we defined it last week. If your opponent is aggro, you are playing control. If your opponent is control, you are playing aggro, is how he lays it out in this article. In this article, he does explicitly say aggro is unfavored against midrange is unfavored against control, and that's just the natural sort of flow of these things. And his whole argument in this entire article for why midrange is bad is because it can't be control. Therefore, midrange is bad. And the reason I find this article puzzling is it doesn't make any mention of the rest of the spread of the rock, paper, scissors matchup, right? So, like, if that's the case, if midrange is terrible, and he's not saying in a specific meta, he's saying broadly. He cites specific instances in many years past where he tried to play midrange in specific formats and metas and always didn't have as much success as he wanted. He's saying broadly, at least in 2009, again, a lot has changed in the past 13 years. He was saying at the time, midrange is just bad and you should avoid it basically across the board, no matter what. If that's true, right? If you have a meta with aggro, midrange, and control, which is what he lays out in his own article, and midrange, he says is favored against aggro, you win the aggro matchups, but you can never be control, and that just means that your deck is not going to be good enough to carry you to day 2 or to win some tournament or whatever. I don't understand how that meta settles, right? Because if that's the case, and no one should play midrange, doesn't that just mean aggro is the best deck?
Right, so you're saying if he's setting up that there is this rock, paper, scissors meta
which
with 3 different items, they should all be equally have places they can't win, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Is it just a difference of degree? Like we also talked last week about how none of these are absolute. It's not like a particular deck will just be 100% loss every single match against this other deck. Yeah. It might just be a difference of 5 or 10%, which is a real and significant, like that's favored to a huge degree. Is it just that in general or in that particular meta of that time, just those numbers, those skews were very different between mid-range and control and the other matchups?
You know, it's not entirely clear to me. If I read between the lines a little bit, I think what he's kind of getting at is that at least the aggro and control decks always get to execute their game plan for the most part. You might get mana screwed or whatever, but your game plan is focused, and so you sit down and you know what your deck's trying to do. He cites in the article examples where, you know, your mid-range deck draws all of your cards you put in the deck to be the control against aggro against your control opponent, and then you can't put on any pressure and you just lose. Or your mid-range deck is paired up against aggro, and you draw all the dinky creatures that you're supposed to try and get it on your control opponent, and now you can't win that matchup either. And so there's this kind of like drawing the wrong half of your deck component to mid-range specifically that I think is kind of at the root of why he's criticizing it.
I think that's fairly compelling. Like the idea of just having a deck that is trying to play multiple different roles depending on the context is going to come with a little bit of a sacrifice, right?
Yeah, and so I think a lot of this then comes down to the specific cards, right? Which again is my whole argument, right? I think the cards is the only thing that matters. And I do think that now, by modern Magic standards, for a lot of reasons, we have a lot of cards that are just good in both matchups. They just can do both things really effectively. Planeswalkers being a key one. This article was written after Planeswalkers, but not very far after Planeswalkers. We were like 2 years into Planeswalkers being a thing, and the design space was very minimal. They hadn't pushed in terms of power level so much yet. So certainly Planeswalkers make a big difference there. I also just think we have more modal cards now, and modal cards very often have modes that are good in different matchups, different types of game states. That just mean that you get to have more things and have mid-range decks that can do both roles without having draws where it's like, here's my handful of Cabal Therapies against my aggro opponent. I put Cabal Therapy in here for the control matchup, and this card is now awful. I don't think it happens as much anymore because we have a broader card pool, and because the design of Magic cards has changed a little bit to make it so you can play both sides pretty safely.
Sure.
But anyway, I think that's his core argument. But as written, if you read this article, I would suggest that you could write this exact same article about any matchup and just say, aggro's bad. You can never beat mid-range. They're going to bring these big creatures and they're going to gain life and you can never win. And you could write the exact same article. You could do the same about control and say control's bad. You can never beat aggro, right? You could just write this article about any one of these rock, paper, scissors matchups, and it would be essentially the exact same article. The only difference is the one we called out of how mid-range is a deck that, as he defines it in this article at least, has two different plans of cards in it that sometimes you draw the wrong half of.
I mean, the other really key difference is that LSV is a very skilled Magic player and just has intuitive experience and understands what the metagame looked like, which, sure, you could write an article which reads as compellingly from any of those different perspectives, but I do put a lot of trust in there being more truth because of the source in that particular one.
I don't think he's wrong at all. Like, I think when this was written, I think he was probably absolutely right that mid-range decks were not good and you shouldn't be playing them because of all the reasons you just mentioned. The different skill of creating transportable knowledge about Magic that is like robust, I don't think he succeeds at here because there is no actual logical.
He hasn't described the why. Well, I mean, again, I think that the argument that it's complicated.
It is complicated, but my point is just that a lot of people pointed me to this article as if I was going to read something that was going to I'd slap my forehead and go, Eureka, I missed this completely. Everyone's right. The rock, paper, scissors thing is true. And I definitely did not. I read this article and I was like, yeah, okay, mid-range was no good at the time he wrote this. That makes sense. More importantly, if you believe this article, then there is no rock, paper, scissors because mid-range is bad. So there is no middle. So it's just a 2-archetype meta, and I guess you just have to choose the right one for the given tournament that's coming up or something, which I also don't think is entirely true. I think it just is more proof in the pudding that the specific cards matter because the cards he mentions being mid-range cards are like Cabal Therapy and Wrath of God in the same deck as Loxodon Hierarch. And yeah, I think those cards are not good. I would not put those cards in a deck and call it successful.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. It sounds like that's describing mid-range as not pulling from the sort of discrete third card pool, but just saying like, oh, we have the aggro cards over here and we have the control cards over here, and we can play any mixture of them we want. And in that context, playing a mixture definitely sounds worse than just committing hard one direction or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. As kind of a foe to this, Dom Harvey also linked me to an article by Paulo Vitor Damaderosa, which was written a few years after LSV's article, and is actually a perfect foil to it, and it describes why mid-range is great, right? And this is just, again, context matters. The card pools had changed. Things were different. It seems like by the time this article was written, like Jund, which is by many people's reckoning the kind of iconic mid-range deck from Constructed, Jund was very popular and very successful. And Paulo just kind of points out that, hey, this deck's great because it gets to play all these cards that are good in both matchups. And the cards are just raw and powerful. And the fact that it gets big creatures makes it good against aggro. And the fact that it gets to have big creatures and also play K-Command and Liliana the Veil just makes it good against control. It just has everything in this like sort of mid-range deck here, which again, to me, just kind of reinforces like, yeah, the card pool's the only thing that matters. There is no actual intrinsic direction to it. In this same article, Paulo does acknowledge in passing, he's like, of course you're favored against aggro because you're a mid-range deck, and that's always the case. And normally you can't beat control decks, but actually this time you can because you have these specific cards. He does kind of acknowledge the assumption of what deck is quote-unquote supposed to win. But then in his article, he kind of goes through and in the same laundry list way we did, says, here's why you can beat control decks as a mid-range deck. You have these threats that line up really badly against their removal, which means that you were just getting card advantage. You have value engines that can go toe-to-toe with like blue card draw in the form of Dark Confidant and Bloodbraid Elf, which just generate tons of value in both tempo and card equity. He points out all the things we said last week about how you can still win as a mid-range deck against control. It's just kind of in this context of like, normally you're not supposed to be able to do it, but right now mid-range is good because you actually can. It's a weird exception. And I'm like, I don't know if it's an exception. It's just, that's how sometimes this matchup is won. So to me, what is consistent between both these articles and what we talked about in the podcast last week is, again, that why layer. I had not read these articles before we recorded last week, but if you look at it, they both go into great detail to explain how decks can beat you. Like in LSV's article, he was like, you play a mid-range deck and sometimes you even lose to aggro because what if aggro has flyers and burn? And it's like, yeah, we talked about flyers. We talked about evasive creatures. We talked about burn. We talked about having mid-range decks that have threats that line up really effectively against removal and ways to disrupt their opponent and get in damage early. We talked about all this stuff. That's the thing that is constant, right? That actually has not changed. Everything else is really context dependent. Like a lot of the specific cards mentioned don't really make sense. And to me, the either writing off mid-range as being inherently bad or saying mid-range is actually great, like that is all context dependent. What's not context dependent, what is the actual underlying nugget of transportable magic knowledge that I'm excited about is the why. Here's how you win if your opponent is slightly bigger than you. You have to do these kinds of things. Here's how you win if you're a mid-range deck that is designed to stuff out aggro decks and you come up against a control deck. Here's how you do it. That how is the thing I'm interested in and want to talk about. And I just want to get away from this assumption of there are inherently favored matchups at each level. This is like the worst episode ever in terms of me just talking at you, and I apologize.
That's okay. I'm just over here with my meat grinder.
I spent a lot of time going through all the feedback this week, and I'm getting real excited about all of it, basically. The last thing I want to mention, this wasn't actually a piece of feedback, but it just came up in my Magic Reddit feed or my social media feed. I forget which one this week, and I thought it was a great example of the ideas we were talking about. Anthony, I have in front of me a table of commonly played creatures in Standard, the top 14 creatures across all of Standard. By the time this comes out, this will be probably a week or two old, but I don't think the Standard metagame is going to shake up too much. Do you want to guess what the rough breakdown of this top 14 creatures in Standard looks like?
I really don't. Do I know what creatures are in Standard right now?
All right, so right now in Standard, a mono-white aggro, I say in big air quotes deck, is pretty dominant.
All right,
Mono-white
so
is really
Luminarch
good.
Aspirant.
That is number one.
Hell yeah.
You have nailed it. This is the top 14 cards in Standard that are creatures, and 13 of them are white, and then there's Goldspan Dragon at 13. The rest of them are all white creatures. Allow me to go down them in order. You mentioned Luminarch Aspirant, 38% of decks. Legion Angel, 36% of decks. Skyslave Apparition, 28%. Elite Spellbinder, 25%. Redain, God of the Worthy, 24%. Brutal Cathar, Guardian of Faith, Archon of Emeria, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. This is a laundry list of all the ways that we said aggro decks can just stomp on mid-range decks. And it brings up the point, if mid-range is supposed to be favored against aggro, and we have a Standard metagame where aggro is dominant, why not simply play the mid-range decks, folks? And I can tell you why, because when you do, your opponent's going to play Luminarch Aspirant, which can grow with your threats and become big enough that you can't block it, even with your mid-range creatures. They're going to play Legion Angel, which is an evasive threat that draws more Legion Angels. They're going to play Skyclave Apparition and remove your blockers. They're going to play Elite Spellbinder and, again, have evasion and disrupt your plan. All of these cards are like a laundry list of ways that aggro beats mid-range. What is not present here, to get all the way down to the 11th and 14th most popular cards in Standard, are 1-drops. Hopeful Initiate, that's the 1-2 with training. Then all the way at 14 is Usher of the Fallen, the 2-1 with the sacrifice to protect thing upside. So A lot of people would argue that like what an aggro deck is supposed to be is a bunch of like cheap aggressive 1-drops that just like bash on your opponent. In this meta, those cards are played 17% and 13% of the decks respectively, but compared to Luminarch, Aspirant, Legion Angel, Cognitive Apparition, and Elite Spellbinder, they're played in like half as many decks. Those cards are just make up this extremely robust deck, which everyone's calling it aggro. Would you maybe call it more mid-range, given that it's playing 4-drops and that draw more 4-drops and your cards can get really big? I don't know. Again, it all comes down to the definitions.
It's correction time again, preemptively. So, took a closer look at this, and many of you who are familiar with Standard were probably screaming at your headphones and saying, hey, these cards are not just played in a mono-white aggro deck, they're also played in a Selesnya deck, which lots of people, at least MTG Goldfish right now, is calling a mid-range deck. So these cards are flexible enough to see play in decks of both definitions, which would explain their extreme popularity in Standard at the moment. I still think the general thrust of my point stands, so I haven't cut anything I said out, but I'm adding this in for additional clarity. It is not a aggro-dominated Standard at the moment. It is a white creatures-dominated Standard, though, if you look at the full spread of the metagame. Look, people, this is very hard. It's so hard to get all this stuff right. We're doing our best. Thank you for your patience.
My point is that this meta is not at all productively informed by the blunt heuristic of mid-range beats aggro. That does not apply here at all. What does apply is look at the cards that are good, that are making up this deck. These cards are a laundry list of ways to dunk on mid-range decks. Every single card references one of the ways we talked about aggro being able to beat mid-range in our last episode. I think the Wandering Emperor is a key part of this deck. That's obviously not in the list of top creatures played because it's not a creature, but that Planeswalker has proven to be quite spicy.
Yeah, it's a powerful Magic card.
Some people, I think it was Sam Black, was asking if it was in the top 5 most powerful Planeswalkers ever printed on Twitter, and there was a discussion about whether or not it was. High praise.
I think it's going to start to get more difficult to answer questions like that as we just see.
It's always impossible to answer questions.
Well,
like
I think that for a long time, Planeswalkers followed a pretty prescriptive pattern. It's like +1, make a token, -2, destroy a thing, -12, you win the game. And we're just seeing so many different Planeswalkers that function in such different ways. It's not as easy to just line them up on one axis and say what's the most powerful and what's not.
It's always impossible to do that, though. Like, context always matters, right? Like, I think Wrenn and 6 is a very powerful Planeswalker, but not in Standard.
Many will agree.
It was never printed in Standard because it was printed in Modern Horizons, but you need fetch lands for that card to be relevant, frankly. Otherwise, it becomes kind of in a weird spot. They're all kind of context dependent. I saw an argument on Twitter which really just felt like it was so useless to me, which was people arguing about whether or not Oko or Lurrus was more powerful. And it's like, you're just like... To me, it's like the argument of like, who's the better athlete, Wayne Gretzky or Michael Jordan? Like,
people love
maybe it's fun to talk about who the better athlete is, Wayne Gretzky or Michael Jordan, but like, it's just they're not the same thing. The context is so important. Like, in specific decks, one or both of those cards could be more powerful or not. It's not a thing that makes any sense to talk about, and people just waste so much oxygen trying to explain their cogent argument for why Oko is more powerful than Lurrus, and it's like, okay, whatever. Stop it.
Maybe you should take a couple weeks off Twitter. Just close that for a little while. You can do that.
Yeah. I had to take some time off of Discord today because of that stupid April Fool's joke.
It was, oh my God.
It's not a joke. Annoying a bunch of people is not a joke.
That's what April Fool's Day is. I think that this is on
Humor's
you.
dead.
This is on you for thinking it's about jokes. It's about making fools of people.
You think it's just annoying people? Well,
Yes.
it's a dumb day.
It is. Correct. It is a dumb day.
Hand on my heart, I promise you now, everybody out there in listener land,
Don't
say Paper and Lucky
don't take
Paper
this from
Radio
us. Don't
will
take this from
never,
us.
ever do an April Fool's joke ever. Now listen, Anthony, here's the deal. I just said we'll never do it, which we probably won't. But if we ever do decide to do it, then we said we'll never do it, which will make it even more convincing when we actually prank people. So it's kind of a win-win. That is most of the feedback I collected from last week's episode, Anthony. In ruminating on what we talked about last week and in reading some of the feedback you read, did you have any other thoughts you want to touch on with regards to the rock, paper, scissors meta of Magic?
I think we covered a lot of it very well here. I would just say again, like, I appreciate all that feedback. We do this podcast just because we like to talk about Magic and meet people and have interesting conversations. And when people reach out and start those conversations, that's just great to hear.
The last thing I want to touch.
All right, so there's one more. There's some low-hanging fruit. I
always say the last one. It's not low-hanging fruit, but I always say the last one just as a way to end. I don't want to end on you being like, nope, that's it. So I always say one. The last thing I want to talk about, which was, I thought, a very interesting theoretical idea that gets a little bit out of the weeds of just trying to define things accurately or whatever, which was one user of the Discord. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the username right now. Just want to mention that I looked it up and it was MTG Cube Talk Discord user Fuego de Suego. Fuego de Suego is fun to say. Was saying that they actually explicitly aim for a rock, paper, scissors meta in their environment. They want to make an environment that plays like this because they think it's kind of boring and the decks all fall flat when every deck can be good against every other deck, which was something that we didn't talk about, and I kind of took for granted that you wouldn't want. Like, you would want every deck to have reasonable matchups against every other deck. But this user very clearly was like, I favor a rock, paper, scissors meta because it means that you have a tide, right? Like, you have decks you are favored against, which means that you can maybe lean back a little bit, and you have decks you have to like scrape and scratch to win. Now, obviously, this is where that like how big is the favored or unfavored thing comes down to, because if we're talking like 55-45 matchups, that's still pretty dynamic and fun. Like, you're unfavored, but you can still pull out a win. I don't think this person is saying they want, 80-20 matchups across their matchup spread. What do you think of that idea of intentionally being like, I want in my environment to make specific decks weak to other decks?
So I completely get what they're saying and totally agree that if you want to have a game that has a diverse metagame while having, lots of different types of strategies and decks, you do need some kind of cyclic nature to the effectiveness of these decks, of the different matchups, so that you have that diversity. Otherwise, you have a degenerate environment where only one thing is effective. What I think is maybe a little bit interesting is when you transition from a constructed environment to Cube to a drafted environment, you kind of have that diversity baked in because, people are competing for individual cards. You can't just have everybody opt to play the one best strategy. People are sort of forced to diversify. So I don't know if I totally agree with them that it is essential in a drafted environment, but I think that from a just game design perspective, having diversity and interesting different strategies, it makes perfect sense. The other thing and maybe this is one of the difficult and sort of points of confusion and where it can be easy to miscommunicate, is there is this idea of a rock, paper, scissors meta where there is a cycle of who's favored in matchups. Aggro mid-range control is not the only way that can happen. And I think that's a lot of what you're trying to say here is just individual cards interact with each other in different ways and create plenty of other cycles of rock, paper, scissors metas. And it doesn't have to be just about this specific cycle.
Yeah, I mean, to talk through that in like a little more detail, in a cube, we have a little bit of a safety buffer because it's very unlikely that your cube meta is actually going to be like cracked and solved compared to like a constructed meta where like if there is dominant strategies, the massive players that are testing every kind of deck and finding it will just find the dominant strategy. So in a constructed meta game, I think a rock, paper, scissors kind of relationship in the abstract makes a lot of sense, because if you do just think, well, every deck can beat every other deck, then the chances that you balanced all of those threats and costs exactly so that those matchup spreads are actually equal are probably not that high. And so what you do is you introduce deck B is favored against deck A, and then that allows players to say, well, if deck A is being played a lot, then deck B is a good like counter choice against deck A, and it can have this kind of self-balancing nature.
Right. The whole sort of definition and sort of existence of what we call a metagame is dependent on that.
Right. And, if you push one of those knobs too far and you just have a deck that doesn't have any weak matchups, then everyone's just playing that deck now. And maybe we'll find out in a couple weeks they'll ban something in standard because maybe mono white is just too good because of all these cards that got printed. Maybe that's just the only thing it's reasonable to play. And so in order to make that deck have a weakness again, they have to like cut something out. So I think in the abstract it makes a lot of sense. And there is a lot of precedence in game design more broadly for putting in outlet valves to allow this kind of meta to develop. I think you said it perfectly, which is that this cycle of power imbalance or favored decks does not have to be on the tempo axis. It can just be that blue is really good against red or whatever. This particular removal spell is good against this particular creature, or planeswalkers are good against this, but there's this great removal spell against planeswalkers that is out there that's kind of floating around. It could be all kinds of layers of different ways that decks can be favored or unfavored against each other that can still allow this to exist without relying on purely that tempo axis. And that to me is what Magic is. Both cube and constructed metagames, it's a lot of really complicated overlapping decisions that can't be simplified into such an elegant heuristic as, well, the fastest decks are going to be favored against the slowest decks and the ones in the middle are going to split. I don't think it works out quite that elegantly.
No, but the heuristics are still useful. So I wouldn't
because of the why. Because of the why. You should listen to the why. But you should also listen to the why of why aggro decks beat mid-range decks sometimes, and why mid-range decks beat control decks sometimes, and why control decks beat aggro decks sometimes. Because the why is what you want to understand as a game designer. And as a player, just trying to be better at Magic, right? To understand what kinds of effects might make aggro a safer proposition against mid-range rather than being a risky all-in thing where you just can't beat a 4-4 or whatever.
The why is definitely the interesting part to me and is long-term, the most powerful sort of thought technology. But just bare heuristics that kind of work are also good scaffolding to getting the job done.
And that's how you get retweets to your article, right? You say something concrete and sticky that you can fit inside a tweet rather than the long, extensive whys. So I get it.
Don't attack a 2-2 into a 4-4. There's a good, solid heuristic.
I thought it was really interesting that looking at all these articles from decade plus ago, that the why was actually consistent. If you unpack what they're all saying, they're getting at the same reasons why certain decks are favored in certain matchups. And what doesn't hold up is the assumption of what deck is naturally favored or naturally bad or naturally a trap because they print new cards. That deck might not be a trap anymore. Okay, I got one last little thing.
Okay.
Again, it's potpourri week. The low point of my cube drafting this past weekend was not just one specific match, which was actually of the gold cube, which is where I also have my favorite matches, but across a couple of different matches, I am so down on life gain, Anthony. I think life gain is just an awful mechanic from a game design perspective.
Look, what's the most important resource in Magic the Gathering?
Mana.
It's your life total,
Mana.
right? The life total is
Mana.
how you lose the game, so that's the most important one.
Card advantage. Cards on board.
Gaining life has got to be great because it puts you further away from losing.
Gaining life is like drawing cards with none of the fun.
Okay, yeah, sure.
That's all it is. You're just giving yourself like another draw step, but in the least satisfying way possible.
I think there are some successful instances of life gain, both in terms of card design and in game moments. But I agree with you broadly that just it does have the potential to create these kind of really punishing game moments where your opponent's just at 100 life, and what are you gonna do? Maybe
not even that. Even just like
it just makes the game so much slower and longer, and the race is so much harder to calculate. It's not, even if you are favored in a match where your opponent has 100 life, you have the clock, you can kill them, but it's a 15 turn clock, and you have 16 cards left in your deck. That's gonna be
and that's like the extreme. I even mean games where you just gain like I played with Omnath, I think Locus of Creation. There's so many Omnaths. The 4-color Omnath that gains 4 life every time you put a land into play, which with fetch lands is, essentially gaining you 7 life. And it was not fun for me to do either. It was like, haha, you thought you had any chance to pressure my life total, but play this one card, and now your entire deck strategy is kind of like negated.
You're right. That actually is the worst part, when it's like, I am thinking about this tempo value axis. I know I'm throwing away resources.
One of the most fun things to think about in Magic.
I know that I have, here's my out. If I draw one more burn spell, it's like worth making this attack, even though I'm, not in a great spot here, but I know that this is my best chance. And then your opponent just gains 2 life incidentally. It's like,
and then I'm like,
no.
bleep blorp, I gained 8 life
no.
this one turn because I happen to have a Omnath in my deck. I don't like it. I will say the only time I have ever found life gain to be a fun thing to play with, I mean, aside from, there's definitely some limited formats where like life gain is basically used as a trigger, like any other trigger, and you can build synergistic decks, and that can be fun.
Johnny's Pridemate is like prime example of good life gain card in my opinion.
But in that case, like the thing that's good about a Johnny's Pridemate is not the life gain. It could be anything that it triggers on. The fact that it triggers on X, it's just a cares about card, right? So there could be cool cards that happen to care about life gain. It's not the life gain that makes them cool. I will say that in my environment where I've pushed life loss so hard, which is something that kind of clarifies why I don't like life gain when you think about how much I've got triple shock lands in my cube with double fetches, like your mana base can oftentimes do 16 damage to you. I think in that context where you are using your life as a resource with pretty much every deck, there you actually do strategically play life gain as like just put me back to like where I was, like put me back to normal, make my opponent actually take my life away instead of that. In that context, I think it can actually be kind of interesting. But I am even looking at Batterskull now and just being like, I don't know about you anymore.
It's a road card.
Because I don't like...
I've played a couple Bowls of Citadels, though, in this last couple weeks, and it's really fun to gain a bunch of life.
That's actually my favorite life gain
card. Now
I've
got a bunch more resources to work with.
That's my favorite life gain card. You're right. And that one only lets you pay life, but that's the best life gain.
Well, it's the contextualization that makes life gain more than just all those other things we talked about.
Right. Context matters, Anthony. Who would have thought?
Context.
Context stinger goes there. All right, that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you again for all the feedback, for anybody out there that sent in some feedback. We do really appreciate it. Anthony, we're going to start doing something now, which is an official countdown to CubeCon. 201 days, 11 hours, 30 minutes, and 57 seconds at time of recording until CubeCon.
Amazing.
Mark your calendar.
I'm so excited.
All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by sorting through Reddit comments and Discord threads of very thoughtful feedback from people so I can relay it accurately and respond to it by speaking into a microphone. Thanks for talking about magic with me, Anthony.
Anytime. Thanks for talking about magic with me. I feel full.
You eat too much sushi?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of sushi did you make?
Pork sushi.
Pork sushi? Hold the f***ing phone, my dude.
I had some roast pork belly, so I made some futomaki.
Sounds great.
Big sushi.
Sounds really good.
It was good. And
as much as I love sushi,
bowl of miso soup.
As much as I love sushi, I think I do like pork belly more. So
pork belly and rice, and I also did it differently than I did yesterday because you got to iterate. A little bit of mayonnaise really kicks it up a notch.
Ooh, tomorrow I'm hoping we can
pork fat with mayonnaise.
Gotta bring your meat grinder tomorrow. We're gonna make just bolognese, but I want to do it all from scratch. Is it in that box? Wow, did you know this guy records the podcast with a meat grinder within reach? We're on episode 91 or whatever. 91 episodes. That meat grinder has been within reach of you, just waiting to be mentioned.
I knew it was coming.